Hello, good morning. Let's see. We are going to roll into actually talking about All the Birds in the Sky this week, which I'm pretty excited about. The discussion questions that y'all submitted are great, and I think that is kind of drive a lot of our conversation. There are a couple things that I wanted to discuss beforehand. My fear with this book was that my whole reaction was just going to be this book is awesome, and that I wasn't going to have much to talk about deeper than that. But I think I've got from your reactions and from sort of thinking about it a little more things that I do want to talk about. So for the lectures for this week, I'm going to talk a little bit about structure, and there was one other thing. I'm going to talk a bit about climate fiction. But first, I wanted to introduce one more sort of theoretical concept for us. And the thing I want to say about theory concepts that I introduce you guys to is very much a your mileage may vary situation. Some people don't care for theory at all and prefer to just do close reading when they're doing critical work, and that is totally fine. Some people find theory to be helpful and to be ways to open up a text. And even for those people, some theories work better than others. Like I am a big fan of Marxist theory and deconstruction, but if you put like Lacan or Freudian theory in front of me, I'm like, this doesn't do it for me. So take this stuff for what it's worth. If it helps you to form sort of a framework for looking at stuff, that's great. If it doesn't seem to be opening up anything new for you, that's fine too. So I want to point out two things that we already have sort of in play. This sort of binary or spectrum of the hero's journey on one end and the carrier bag theory on the other end. And these are ideas of narrative structure that run from very, very plot-driven. I'm trying to remember which which hand I'm using. Very, very plot-driven, forward, sort of traditionally masculine narrative form to a more anthropological collection of things that maps, for one thing, onto a very traditional, like early form of the novel, but also has implications that are feminine, or they're traditionally mapped onto feminine qualities. So, keeping in mind that anytime that we talk about a binary in this class, we are probably talking about a false binary and something that is going to reconcile with its opposite in either the form of a spectrum or in a fully formed dialectic where these things become thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Ha. I think I may have mentioned dialectics before, but keep in mind that dialectics are different from Dianetics. Dianetics is the Scientology thing. Dialectics is Hegel and Marx and various theoreticians. So I want to talk a bit about a mode of thinking. I want to talk about science fictionality. I think a nice thing with this class and with this text in particular is that you guys are already sort of primed to move beyond this idea of whether it is a science fiction text or a fantasy text. I think we could argue that the tech is so sort of so fictionalized that we could conceive of it as fantasy tech, and thus Phyllis is a fantasy novel. We could also say that the magic system is so fleshed out that it is a form of technology in the same way that language is a technology or agriculture is a technology. And do keep that in mind as when you think of terms of technology, that this doesn't always mean machines. Modes of thought, modes of culture can also be technology. Capitalism is a technology. Language is a technology. Agriculture. I think I don't need to really make the argument for you guys that this is one side or the other, but let's look at it for the moment or keep it in our heads as a science fiction novel. And now I want to talk about this idea of science fictionality or science fictional thinking. And as we move forward, I'm going to present the other side of this binary, which is going to be Gothic thinking. So Gothic thinking is sort of, again, trouble with orienting of the hands. Gothic thinking is going to be sort of oriented on past, and science fictional thinking is going to be oriented on future, but they are all about how we deal with and conceive of ourselves in the present. So, science fictional thinking. This is put forward by two, both Russian theorists. One of them is Darko Suvin in a book called The Metamorphosis of Science Fiction in 1979, and the other one that I'm drawing a little more heavily from is The Seven Beauties of Science Fiction by Istvan Cesare Ronin Jr. Again, Russian theorist. This is the book. I'm not making you read it because it's pretty dense. So one thing that we need to know is where science fiction comes from, and that it comes at a moment in development of capitalism that is involved in a sort of technological shift. And most people are going to map the beginnings of science fiction onto authors like H.G. Wells and Mary Shelley to some extent. And we are going to talk a whole lot more about Frankenstein and how it works as a science fiction and a Gothic text. That's going to be fun. That's going to be later. But critically speaking, science fiction is always kind of discounted because the writing is bad. And this persists when we, this persists when we talk about science fiction markets currently and what constitutes upmarket sci-fi, what constitutes a literary crossover into sci-fi, and what constitutes just sort of general science fiction. And a lot of times the argument is that science fiction, there is a classic argument that science fiction is, by implication, not well written. That is kind of bunk. It has always been kind of bunk. And it also assumes that literary fiction is automatically well written, which is equally bunk. So one thing that what is his name again? Let's call him Rone. Yeah. One thing that Rone and Darko Suvin point out is that science fiction has always been a sort of self-aware genre. It's always been a genre that's invested in policing its own borders and defining itself as a genre. There's an old line that it's Gertrude Stein. Gertrude Stein says that America is the oldest country because it's the first country to enter the 20th century, and an argument can be made that science fiction is the oldest genre because it is the first. It is always the first genre to be entering the future. So we've talked a lot about like what conventions and tropes mark something as sci-fi, but one thing I want to keep in mind, and we have talked a little bit about this. Sorry, my dog is jumping around outside, and I keep getting distracted. Is that science fiction is a style that is based on estrangement and dislocation. It is always introducing us to something new and different. Whereas literary or realistic fiction might be said to be about recognition. Science fiction is at best about, the French term is méconnaissance, misrecognition. So we see our world, but it is different, it is changed, it is warped. And the experience of the reader is one of estrangement and dislocation, and this is produced by ideas of newness, of new technology, of new worlds. So what happens as a result of this? What happens as a result of being in this mode of constant, and the argument by Suvin and Cesare Rone is that we as modern humans are constantly in this mode of science fictional thinking. This is how we interact with the world. And Rone talks about three effects that are produced by this. And one is a spur to creativity, to actualization of science fictional concepts. So you can take this as far back as Jules Verne and ideas of like the invention of the submarine. And I don't know enough about Jules Verne to know like exactly when the submarine is like created and popularized versus when 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is written. But to move to something that I can actually speak to, Leo Szilard, who is one of the chief scientists on the Manhattan Project creating the atomic bomb, was inspired to create the atomic bomb by the work of H.G. Wells, where Wells posits the idea of a bomb that is based on sort of nuclear power. And 50 years before, Szilard works on the bomb. The other big example is the work of William Gibson, who wrote Neuromancer, who sort of pioneered this idea of cyberspace. And as programmers got into this book and fell in love with this book, they created a cyberspace. They created an idea of cyberspace that, to some extent, mirrored the way Gibson conceived of it before it existed. And we can, if you want to get nerdy about computer stuff, I'm happy to do that. Gibson Gibson's idea of cyberspace was a lot more phenomenal, like received through the senses. So, when you see that there's this constant striving to create like VR environments, which VR has never really taken off the way we were sold it when I was a kid. But that the whole concept of VR, of cyberspace as a space, is very much a Gibson concept. And what we've ended up with the internet is a cyberspace that's more noumenal. It's more about ideas and words, and that's an interesting conflict. But for a long time, the goal of computer programming and the ideas of the internet were to create a Gibsonian cyberspace. So that is one of the effects of of science fictional thinking, is creative production and actualization of science fiction concepts. The second one is identification, and this is something that I think we see a lot of when we talk about particularly the superhero genre. But it's sort of an extended imaginative play. Like it's the kid who gets a lightsaber and plays that way, and then extends that into adulthood, and it's this identification with the characters that we see in science fiction. I think more and more this is an ongoing thing in adulthood. Whether it's as simple as oh yeah, I'm a Ravenclaw, which we're probably not doing that anymore. But it's that kind of thing. It's identification with concepts and characters within science fictional and fantasy worlds, and that does sort of connect in a lot of ways to the hero's journey. But in some cases, like with the idea of Hogwarts houses, it's more mapped onto a carrier bag theory. It's like I find this one thing in this world that I identify with, and I sort of map onto my sense of self. But the key one, and the one that I want us to sort of think about as we read the text and think about generally, is how we react to things. Particularly how we react to technology, how we react to actual newness in the world. And science fiction becomes a sort of thesaurus for terms and for images, so that when we see footage of protests and counter-protests I'm going to let the dog in. When we see footage of protests and counter-protests in Portland, we may be thinking of a dystopian film that we've seen. When we look at we may say things about, for instance, our phones that make it sound like a sort of technology that's alienated from us, as if we don't actually have it. I put some food out, and she just came to steal it real quick. We often think of technology that we have as future technology, even though we have it. Just keep doing this. Hey, get in here. Come on. So when a new technology sort of comes into use, we think of it the way that we might think of tech in a science fiction novel or a book. This is similar we have a similar reaction to certain events. And when I talk about technology, I'm talking about a lot of different technology. I'm talking about iPhones, GMO, agriculture, the body modification and sort of post-humanism, all sorts of things that may have been unimaginable to, say, our parents, but were within a realm of imagination that was available to science fiction writers. And that is, when we talk about science fictional thinking, the argument is that science fiction as a genre has shown higher efficacy for imagining a future which is now the present. So we are science fictional thinking means that we are acting and interacting with our world with this same form of dislocation and estrangement and misrecognition, that we are receiving technologies and technological concepts and developments as if they are future objects or future concepts, future happenings. And this is, the general thing is this sense of when people say we are living in the future, that is that is a sort of foundational tenet of what I mean when I say science fictional thinking. And one last thing that I want to talk about, because it does become important in this book in particular, is that science fictional thinking shares certain elements with apocalyptic thinking, with religious, particularly religious teleological apocalyptic thinking, that all events map onto sort of how the world is going to end. Certainly, there are apocalypses built into science fictional thinking in general. There are teleologies, which means sort of modes of thinking that have an endpoint. I think the two big ones that are common to all or most science fictional thinking are the idea of technological singularity, which is a sort of it's the point where we can be replaced by robots, or can like install when we can leave our bodies, where consciousness can be separated from physicality. And the other one, which is sort of more relevant here, is climate apocalypse, and a sort of inevitable unraveling of physical environment. And these things, singularity and climate apocalypse, like play out in science fictional thinking in sort of parallel or in a race with each other. And to some extent, that's what Anders is playing with here, is those two factors. But so again, to summarize really quickly, when we talk about science fictional thinking as a mode, it is a thinking of a mode of thinking where you are constantly future oriented, but where things in the present are received with a sense of dislocation and alienation, separation, and misrecognition as future objects. And it really does boil down to this idea of like, the future is now, we are living in the future. And it is like influenced or draws its sort of metaphorical strength from science fiction as a genre. And as we move forward, we're going to contrast this with Gothic thinking, which is about the past, and we're going to start to see both of these modes sort of active in a lot of these texts. Okay, that went way longer than I wanted, and I will be back with two more short ones in a bit.